All right, we're live here, September 21st. This is Sharif Yunus here with Dr. Kevin Majors. Kevin, welcome.
Good morning.
And we're here to talk about optimal work and some new topics that maybe we haven't gotten a whole lot into before, but they're definitely relevant. And it'll definitely be interesting to see how our approach applies in these areas. So, Kevin, what you wanted to discuss today was anger. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that we've talked a number of times about anxiety, and that's, the fight or flight response. But the anxiety part's the flight part. And we haven't spoken much about the fight part. So, but the very same things that trigger anxiety also can trigger anger. And so it would be, I think, good that we discuss a little bit about that so that people
Mm-hmm.
see that it's not any different and that the same approach works. And you can actually use the triggers for anger to really thrive in life.
Mm-hmm. So it kind of rounds out the model of the amygdala. Would it be fair to say the amygdala is involved here as well? It's the same. We talk about the three steps of the amygdala detects the threat, sounds the alarm, and then watches your response.
Hmm.
And then in the case that you flee, it's anxiety. And in the case that you
Or if
fight,
you fight,
yeah. So fight or
then
flight.
it's anger.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. And you get the same kind of heart racing, like when you're really angry, you get all the same physiological reactions.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and at the same time, I think anger is a little bit of more elevated emotion because it typically is responding to higher level things than simply threats, like
Okay.
physical threats.
It's responding to higher level things than merely physical threats.
Yeah. And in
Okay.
particularly the way people experience it, anger is much, in a sense, more connected to bonds. We only really get angry with people that
Mm-hmm.
we have a bond with, people that we
Mm-hmm.
love. And that bond in some way is just a fact and is part of us. And then that's often where anger comes up. And so when people have, particularly when you think of in couples, that there's the goal of like being loving and having this life together. And then when things seem to threaten that, that's when anger really kicks in.
Mm-hmm.
That there's Sue Johnson has a wonderful book called Hold Me Tight. And she thinks that fights, arguments, anger are really protests about the bond. People are afraid that the bond is coming apart. And
Uh-huh.
the response then is to somehow bind together, and anger tries to do that. This idea that really fights are a protest over the bond, not that the bond is there, but that they're afraid the bond is weakening.
Mm-hmm.
And so, often when anger gets really triggered, it's because it feels like the bond, this deep thing in life, is somehow in jeopardy, that the other person isn't really caring for us. And so they're not really caring for the bond and we don't matter to them. And then anger comes to try to make us matter again. I think it's actually a very great insight. And I recommend the book Hold Me Tight uh, to people all the time and had really good results with it.
Interesting. So is this something that comes up a lot when you're working with people? Or what kind of got you interested in this topic? Because
Well,
it's not
it's
something that's necessarily super related to work, I would imagine.
no, but people would come to me purely for anger issues. And sometimes I found that anger was like, in some ways, like a simple thing to work for, on.
Mm-hmm.
Because oftentimes people get caught simply acting on their anger. Well, the original book on anger from a more CBT perspective was called Anger, the Misunderstood Emotion. Uh, and the basic idea of the book was that people have this idea that when you get angry, you have to vent it. Otherwise, like bad things will happen. So
Yeah.
there's this idea that you have to let it out.
So you have
And
like
while,
some amount of anger,
yeah,
and if you don't let it out now, it's gonna come out when you can't control it or something. It's gonna
exactly.
have
It's like the
worse
hydraulic
consequences.
theory of emotion. Like emotion
Yeah.
is just a pressure and it has to be released.
Yeah.
And so there's this idea that like, now I think there is some truth in what people are detecting, which is you cannot ignore anger. So ignoring anger is probably the worst thing you can do with it.
Mhm.
Because then what happens is you ignore it, ignore it, ignore it, and then it bursts forth when you simply can't ignore it anymore. So you get into this dynamic with anger where you try to control it and deny it and avoid triggers, and you're avoiding, 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 and then boom, there's some kind of, once there's a
Yeah.
trigger you can't avoid, then it erupts. And that's a real common dynamic. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that venting anger and letting it control your behavior
Mhm.
is the solution, because you're only going to reinforce it. The more people vent anger, the more they become angry people. And
Mhm.
so they keep on acting on it, and they get less and less in touch, you could say, with the real issue, which is wanting a loving relationship, wanting to be, like respected and cared for and heard and understood and all these things, and wanting to actually be understanding and caring. And so people end up, let me say that there's this metaphor that's super useful, that
Okay.
if you have a relationship and, let's say that anger keeps getting in the way and people keep acting on it, I like to use the bus metaphor. Have I talked about that much before?
Not on our show, I don't think.
Okay.
But
I
I've heard it come up before.
you've heard, yeah.
With, I think,
The
in
bus,
regard to mindfulness.
yeah. So the bus metaphor is what happens when you find yourself stuck. And sometimes this happens in relationships. People just feel stuck, and anger is a big part of it. The idea is, imagine you're a bus driver and you have all these unruly passengers on, and you're arguing with them and trying to pull them off the bus. Those passengers are your own thoughts and emotions.
Mhm.
And let's say all the passengers in this case are angry. So there's a
Yeah.
lot of shouting and fighting. Well, as long as you're struggling with your own thoughts, with your own emotions, you're not driving the bus.
Mhm.
So you could just be stuck in a bad neighborhood, and not going anywhere. The idea is you have to have your destination in mind, which is ultimately ideals. Where do you really want to go? And then drive and just focus on one street, one turn at a time on the way to your destination, acting to get to that destination, not to mollify the passengers.
Mhm.
And what'll happen is at some point you're going to need to make a turn. Say you have to turn left, and all the passengers erupt, right, right, right,
Yeah.
turn right, and they're shouting. Well, if what would happen if you give in to them? Now they're in control, and you're just going to be lost again.
Mhm.
They're not, the passengers are not, meant to drive the bus, and they don't really have the destination in mind. Instead, you just keep driving, and you learn to separate the driving, the act of driving, guided
Mhm.
by the destination, from all these passengers and what they're telling you to do. If you have that approach to it, gradually you don't even pay attention to the passengers so much, and little by little they get, some end up leaving, some are not there anymore, and you're getting to like the better and better neighborhood of the destination. And the closer you are to that destination, which in fact is not fully attainable, you end up having a much calmer ride. But the goal wasn't to somehow get rid of any particular passenger. It's
Mhm.
simply make progress towards the destination. And that idea is really powerful, that as when you try, especially if you've been like struggling with anger and you're trying now to be loving, to be patient, to be understanding, there are going to be times when all the passengers will erupt and
Mhm.
tell you to do something else. And you have to just accept that they're there, don't fight them, you know, and continue. So that's how that is a great way of thinking of it. That
Right.
you're not trying to get them off the bus, but you're not trying to hold them on. You're just being aware of their presence as passengers, and then you continue toward your destination.
Right. So I can see how that's very similar to the kind of mindfulness approach. If you think of the passengers on the bus as like distracting thoughts, that you're just trying to
Exactly.
keep your attention focused on
Yeah.
what you're working on. Okay. So then, okay, now I have a couple issues with it.
All
No,
right.
it's a couple of questions about this metaphor. Um, so one is now when it comes to anxiety, we talk about when you feel the anxiety, you feel adrenaline, and the adrenaline is there to help you work, to help you perform at your best.
Mhm.
But here it seems like with these passengers on the bus, there's no sense of like kind of transforming it to help you, but it's just like repressing it, repressing the thoughts or repressing the
Yeah.
emotions, right?
Yeah.
So there's a little, so is there any dynamic there with anger where whatever's like, is there anything to reframe there?
Yeah. So there is a limitation to the metaphor,
Okay.
but the turns you have to make on your way to the destination are the very things where the passengers start kind of, erupting.
Yeah.
And those can be signals to you that if you just continue on your way to the destination, like this is the opportunity to be really deliberate
Hmm.
about what you're doing. So sometimes the passengers erupt when there's important triggers or turns that you have to make. So
Yep.
maybe that's one way that, like, if you just used your emotions, you would actually see that the moment that they're erupting is precisely the when the shaping occurs and when you
Right.
make decisive turns in the direction of your ideals. So
Right.
maybe that'd be one way of doing it, but it's true,
Okay.
you're not actually using the energy of it, and
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
it doesn't capture the real power of reframing.
Hmm.
And in relationships, when the anger is put in the broader context of what am I aiming for here, if what you're really aiming for, is the loving relationship, it can be actually a rebirth of the relationship,
Right.
and a recommitment, and then everything kind of, in the process of coming together again, there is actually this positive energy together.
Right. So that the moments that bring up anger, those are challenges, and the challenges are always opportunities to strengthen the relationship in the long run.
Exactly. Exactly.
Hmm. Okay. And then, okay. And then another possible question about this metaphor is like where it's just you and I guess your mind is the bus or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
Your body, I
so
guess your body, your whole
your
body.
body, your body's
Yeah. Yeah.
so where, how do other people fit into that picture? It just seems to be like a kind of self-centered view of how
Okay,
things
that
work.
actually, I think that is that's a real limitation of the metaphor, because like, yeah, exactly. Especially if you're if you're thinking about super close relationship, someone you
Hmm.
have a really deep bond with. Are they a passenger? Are they?
Yeah.
No, they're not. Is the goal that there's really just two buses driving in parallel, and trying to get to the same place, but they
Hmm.
could just as easily not do that. That's the problem. In a sense, here we have to like or change the metaphor a bit. It's like there are two people, you and your closest one, in sharing the driver's seat.
Mm.
And what that actually does capture is this truth that in relationships, you often cannot tell to whom do the passengers belong. So you might like be experiencing,
Mm.
some emotion, but really it's because that's what your spouse or whoever is experiencing.
And you're
And
empathizing or
yes, because the bond shares emotions between both people. Anyone you're very closely bonded with, it can be hard to distinguish, is it my emotion or theirs? And so that actually really does happen, that you can't tell in the moment,
hmm.
am I angry, or is she angry, or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
There's this deep sense that you share everything. But the thing is, it doesn't work to just be driving parallel buses. You really have to be in the same bus driving together, because you have the same destination. You both want a loving relationship. And what can happen sometimes in relationships is that everything is just proceeding smoothly because there's no turbulence, there's never been, a problem. Well, in that case, you don't really know. Are these two people in the seat together, or are they just parallel buses?
Mm.
And I think this happens with young people, especially um, that because they think that the ideal for a relationship is that everything is perfectly smooth all the time.
Hmm.
But without challenge, there wouldn't be like the actual growing together,
Yeah.
where you both have to set aside particular outcomes you're attached to, sacrifice them for the sake of the relationship.
Hmm.
And that willingness to sacrifice attachments, to sacrifice outcomes for the sake of the other person, that's when you really grow closer together. And that's actually the work of sincerity. Sincerity, the way we talk about it, is always the willingness to sacrifice outcomes for ideals.
Right.
But that's precisely what gets lived in moments of trouble in relationships, or moments when, when people are angry at each other. You have to like really be seeing, okay, for each of us, this is an opportunity to recommit to a loving relationship,
Hmm.
and to accept, you know, that we're not going to get necessarily everything we have our heart set on, but that's okay, because the ideal, the relationship itself, the bond is what matters. And that willingness to sacrifice outcomes, attachments for the sake of the other, that's like the real thing that sincerity does. And that can only happen in those moments where there are cross purposes and turbulence. So the challenges that would make us angry need to become an occasion for sacrifice for the bond
That
and
brings
this
us closer
willingness.
together.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like, where does the word sincerity come from? You're the one who taught me this.
Yeah.
Because most people think
Some
it goes,
Greek word.
exactly. Yeah. Most people think it is Latin based,
Yeah.
sine cere, so without wax, as if it means unalloyed, just pure.
Yeah.
But in fact, it's from a Greek root, and it is, if correct me if I'm wrong here, because I'm quoting you, but it's actually growing together.
Yeah.
So
Like
sum,
seen crescere or something. Yeah.
yeah, so the growing together, and it's for two trees, that when the trees are joined in their vulnerable parts, they actually then can grow into each other, and if there's no thick bark there.
Hmm.
And so in moments of vulnerability, we can actually grow together, and you become one. It's like these trees that they were training back in Greece, and some Europe.
Yeah.
That's actually how it was through um, they were allowing them to grow together. And in relationships, sincerity is how you grow together, and it's the mutual willingness to let go of attachments and recommit to the bond. And every time that happens, that is a chance to get more powerfully bonded.
Hmm.
And that's where you see the flip, where all that energy that was being wasted in anger can now be redirected into the life of the bond, and
Hmm.
and people grow together.
So, okay, that's super helpful. Okay, so this seems like it's focusing kind of on like an already like existing and pretty deep relationship that we're talking about here. Now, what are the kind of challenges you're going to face like early on? Like if, I feel like there's just a stage kind of
Mm-hmm.
early on where you're like, okay, am I really going to commit to this? It's like you're friendly, you're enjoying the company, and then it's like, the
Mm-hmm.
how do you really make the commitment to the person? um
I think that the number one thing is you both have to share the same ideals.
mhm,
Otherwise, you don't have the same destination. And how do you drive the bus together? Because in every close friendship, without shared ideals, then how would you be able to make sure you're driving to the same place?
mhm,
The problem that usually happens is, in fact, you do share the ideals, because everyone really does want to be, understanding and understood, loving and loved. So everyone has these deep ideals, and we're attracted to them. And we should be in a state of readiness to form bonds of friendship with everyone. Another big problem is if people are, um, it's there's a difference between anger and frustration.
mhm,
You could be frustrated, with you go to some kind of hardware store and no one's helping you find anything, and it can be super frustrating,
yeah,
that you can't find it and no one's helpful. Um, well, you're not exactly looking to form bonds with the people. You're trying to like get something done, and there's going to be a part of, even then I think we need a kind of readiness to form bonds, this disposition to form bonds with the people that were, so you wouldn't just be demanding of the the people working there, but you try to say, oh, hey, how's your day going?
mhm,
There's always a little gesture at that. But when people are simply seen as obstacles, like thwarting our desired outcomes, then we
yeah,
get frustrated with them.
yeah,
When we're just frustrated with people, then you have to say, okay, is this a chance for me to make a sacrifice of some particular outcome for the sake of something, some higher ideal, some higher
mhm,
bond? And sincerity is what allows you to be willing to make that sacrifice, and to treat others well, and to be always like disposed towards friendship with people. I think that in offices, you need this disposition toward friendship with everyone,
Yeah.
even to like live justice. That there's something about the willingness, openness to being friends that
Yeah.
allows you just to not treat people as means to be used
Yeah.
as an end.
Yeah. You can't just
And
go in focusing on getting your projects done or
yeah,
getting your promotion or whatever it is.
yeah, exactly. And it can happen certainly, that um, people have, just what Aristotle called friendships of pleasure, but it's just that you find the same things enjoyable.
Mm-hmm.
And that's more like parallel buses. It's not really that you have a shared destination, some shared, commitment to each other, some shared, ideals of how to be,
Yeah.
friendly, how to be loving, but instead it's just that there's a mutual enjoyment or use. And that's simply not open to like a higher bond.
Right.
So there has to be this commitment, this willingness to form the deep bond.
Awesome. Well, Kevin, that's our time for today. Do you have any last thoughts to summarize maybe one takeaway or?
Only that the idea of like every time there's a turmoil, the real way to turn it around is sincerity. To be deeply like, you have to be willing to throw everything overboard. Get like the ship's about to sink, be willing to cast everything
Mhm.
aside for the sake of saving the ship and the bond. And so that's the disposition of sincerity. You sacrifice projects for people. You sacrifice outcomes for the bond.
Yeah.
The other
Awesome.
thing, just to
Oh yeah.
mention
Yeah, of
briefly,
course.
that the simplest way many times of handling anger in the moment is to ask the simple question, how angry am I? And try to scale it 1 to 10.
Mm-hmm.
Just the act of trying to like treat your anger as something to work with, that it's something inside of you. It's a passenger on the bus. It's not you.
Yeah.
It separates you. It puts them back in the back seat. So you say, how angry am I? And you say, okay, it's like a 3 out of 10. Okay. Just the act, and this works for children too, just the act of asking that question gives you enough mindfulness, self-possession to then recommit to your ultimate
Hmm.
goals.
That's cool. That's really cool.
Great.
Good. Well, we'll be back next week with some interesting things to discuss. So see you then.
Great.
Thanks so much, Kevin.
Thanks, Sharif.